Welcome, everybody. Unfortunately, I might not be able to make a little special greeting that I managed to get from a special head of the show's production team, unfortunately, because I have difficulty of connecting this major Bluetooth device here for now, but I will be able to use the time, and I will have time for questions as well. But I would like to welcome you to celebrate with me the 30th anniversary of the 1990s Spider-Man, the animated series. The V has been established as a word for it because it basically established the majority of the characters used around Marvel's universe at the time, straight from the comic books, and maybe a bit beyond that. The show is pretty important to me personally, as you can see here. This is me. This picture here is in 1999, and that is a Mayday balloon of Spider-Man, and I'm wearing a Batman t-shirt. And that, as you can tell, you can basically say that whether you like Spider-Man or Batman, it doesn't matter. You don't have to choose camps. You can be both at the same time. That's kind of the message that the show itself always wanted to send, at least the way I portrayed it. You have to want to be yourself and express it and be accepted as who you are. Now, what is in store for you, my dear fellow true believers? Just like Stan Lee said once. I'm going to be going through the pre-production, certain portions of it, and certain parts in the beginning of the production of the series, right before it even started and headed off, because it was quite rocky. And then I'm going to go through a little bit of the show's own production, and then the most complicated structure that an animated series has ever had, at least in terms of storytelling and the way it was produced. Almost basically everything that this show hasn't been recreated or repeated after 1998, since the show ended. But let's begin. We're going to have to make a little leap to year 1991. In 1991, the comic book industry during the time in the decade was kind of struggling. Both DC and Marvel were having financial difficulties because comic books were basically being produced at such a high rate that the quality was suffering and the sales weren't meeting expectation, fans weren't happy. And that meant that they were trying to get investors. In 1991, Marvel made a huge promotional video where they basically laid over a portrait of what they've done in the previous decades with several different companies, and they were trying to sell investors an image that, yeah, Marvel can sell your cars, Marvel can sell trading card games, everything that you can imagine. Marvel is trying to put their foot down and say that we can do this, we can make you rich. They went to the stock market, and well, 5 years later, after this big reel where they were including a Spider-Man movie directed by James Cameron, which never came to fruition, and the recently leaked Fantastic Four movie before this current one that is running in theaters was never shown in any other theaters around, but was still produced, but canceled its distribution. But the big leap failed, and basically everything that came out of it was the Marvel animated universe, which started with X-Men in 1992. That's at least true what came out of that promotional reel in certain terms. Now we're going to be beginning the pre-production era. That is a beautiful picture, by the way. That is a screen that has been used multiple times in the animated series because the show was a pretty low budget type of show, that the budget was pretty constrained, where they had to use a lot of animated cells multiple times in many different episodes during the show's runtime. But let's begin by establishing how this show became what it is. During the pre-production time, they were trying to hire writers. Naturally, a good show needs good writers. And what they were trying to go for is that during the time, of course, when they were competing with DC, they were trying to snag Martin Pasco, who already had been writing for Batman the Animated Series back in 1992. But Martin Pasco passed this. So what they came up with is basically they just took someone, the name escapes me as it did with my questions when I asked John Semper Jr. about this. Unfortunately, the one writer that made a whole mess for John, mentioned here, has passed away, so even he doesn't know the answer to why he made certain decisions along the way. So what happens when all of this flung goes along? In between 1992 and 3, Stan Lee approaches John Semper Jr., who's already a known writer in Hollywood at the time, and he had a lot of writing credits all over the place. So Stan Lee thought he was the perfect fit, and I'd like to think that he definitely was. And one of those major historical things that was mentioned, because there was no writing at all, because when that one writer left, nothing of the material that he produced could be used at all as reference to start over. What he had done could not be used. So John didn't have anything. He had to start from scratch. And he had about, 1.5 years, maybe less? So at the time, there is this rumor/legend, which I didn't get an answer to, but in the internet, it has been said that during the negotiations with John and the channel network Fox, John said that he needed some material to actually see what he was going to start doing. He was a fanatic of Spider-Man already in the 1960s all the way to 80s, as he had said in the interview that I got from him, that he read all the comics all the way till then, but he needed the source material, so what did he do? He negotiated that he would be purchased a comic book collection all the way from 1967, from the first issue of Amazing Spider-Man, so that he could use and read and reference for the making of the show. So the show actually was pretty heavily supervised during its pre-production and during its first season, even though Marvel was financially struggling, so they had very many other things to focus on. Stan Lee and Avi Aran, who was the CEO of a company called Toybiz, who was responsible for making the Spider-Man show toyetic, basically merchandising the character and everything that came out of it. And the supervising only happened during the first season. And as mentioned there, budget limits were narrowed for the show, and which were basically moved into the toy sales, so that if the toy sales were successful, maybe the show would get a little more leisure way. Which it did, but not enough for saving it from the bankruptcy, because they had all these other projects. Now, what Avi Aran and John Semper negotiated between themselves was that when John Semper told him that he wanted to do this kind of show, the way he wrote it was not something Stan Lee nor anyone basically would have accepted at the time, because the way animated shows were done back then and as they are basically done now, they're basically one-off shows. As an episode happens, nothing basically might happen again. The same kind of interactions with characters or plots that would stick. And that's what John Semper wanted to do with his writing, and he had to convince Avi Aran that the show was going to sell the toys, not the toys making the kids watch the show. That's a very big difference between every other show at the time, how this was made. Now let's get to the meat of the actual show itself. And we're going to be starting off with its incredible, I'm going to say incredible because there are a lot of voice talents within Spider-Man the Animated Series that have never been repeated before afterwards, at least in my personal opinion, unless you put a lot of money on the table. Spider-Man the Animated Series got a hold of the best kind of voice cast that there has ever been. There is a big list, and I'm going to be getting through it. But in the US dub, Christopher Daniel Barnes became the iconic voice of Spider-Man back in the day. Before that, he had already starred in the Little Mermaid movie as Eric. That's where he is known from before Spider-Man. So adapting from that must have been, I don't know, maybe difficult, but he was already known from The Rascals from live acting scene. So he had a bit of a temper too, but adapting it from this kind of show from a mermaid movie must have been pretty different. But to this date, he is still considered the voice that when everyone reads comics, at least the ones who watched the show at the time, they know that they will hear Christopher Daniel Barnes' voice when they hear Peter Parker or Spider-Man speaking. Now, in difference between certain animated shows at the time, beside Batman the Animated Series, all the scenes that were recorded in the sound booth, every actor was present at the same time for every scene. Only the monologues were different, but every scene that had more than one character, I'm talking about 5 or 6, they had to basically make sure that the microphone did not capture the voices in a loop. They had that challenge for them, but they seemed to succeed in it, making sure that it didn't actually show. And now I'm going to go through this amazing cast of talent. Hank Azaria may not be familiar to certain people as a name, but I will mention that he may be known as Mo Zizlag, for example. He was a main cast character in The Simpsons starting from 1990s and voiced so many characters I can't even count, both African American and Caucasian, everything. And he became the iconic voice of Eddie Brock and Venom, which, again, if you hear Venom speaking anywhere in the comics, I can't think of anyone else but to listen to him speak. And then there's, of course, other kinds of talent. Back in the end tail of 1990s, David Hayter became the iconic voice of a video game character. But he started off in the animated scene. At least this is my memory of a major credit that he got before that, is that he portrayed Captain America during season 5 at the tail end of the series. Now, Mark Hamill managed to get into the show as well. He became the Hobgoblin. The Hobgoblin actually showed up first in the series. That was not meant to be, basically. But there is a different story to it, and I'll tell that in a later bit. But a little bit of insight to Mark Hamill himself, how he saw himself as the Hobgoblin and his role. He really had difficult time of distincting himself from the Joker as to becoming the Hobgoblin, another villain role. Distincting the voice between the two was hard for him, and he kind of has a disappointment for his portrayal of Hobgoblin. But I personally like to think that his line delivery and what lines were wrote for him kind of supported that it made a little bit of a distinction between what Hobgoblin wanted to do as a villain versus what the Joker did. That's why I think Mark Hamill is wrong with his opinion. I'm sorry. Then a couple of other interesting aspects here. James Avery. How many of you have heard of the name James Avery here? A couple. Good. Because he is also known as Uncle Phil, the man who yells at Will Smith when he's not slapping people at the Oscars. So he was one major role that he had. He done one voice for this one. He has other animated show credits, but in the Spider-Man universe, he did War Machine. So that is the kind of a substitute for Iron Man. He appeared in the season 3 episode where Carnage is also introduced. Then there's Allison Court, who portrayed Jubilee. Why am I mentioning an X-Men character here? X-Men visited Spider-Man the Animated Series back in season 2 and at the tail end of the show in Spider-Wars during season 5. Now, Allison Court has also, kind of like David Hayter, Allison became Claire Redfield in the Resident Evil series and portrayed that role over a decade. And the reason why I wanted to bring X-Men to the table once more is because Spider-Man wasn't allowed to visit any other show that Marvel produced at the time. Everyone else, every other character, they could come to this show, but Spider-Man could never show his face everywhere else. There is a cameo scene, at least in X-Men actually, where he doesn't show his face, but his hand, where he swings a web and saves somebody. That's his cameo back in the tail end of X-Men. That is a pretty interesting, I have no idea why. Is it due to copyright issues, or is there some kind of contracts that he wasn't allowed to show up anywhere else? but that is the case. The last here is an interesting, this is probably the only theatrical backgrounded character. He's probably also the second oldest at the time who portrayed any voice. He portrayed Kingpin. Kingpin is a Daredevil villain, but here Kingpin established himself as a Spider-Man villain. And what I have to say about Roscoe himself, he is an African-American character portraying a white male character. And why I always hear his voice as the Kingpin instead of anyone else is because he brings this kind of royal sound to it. He makes me feel like he owns the world. He built an empire from scratch, and he brings it out to the table. And he outdoes everyone in the show also. That's why I always loved Roscoe's portrayal of Kingpin in the show. And he shows up all the way to the end of the series, all the way to the last episode, which is kind of amazing that you could keep a side character out of another comic book as a villain for Spider-Man. And Spider-Man actually fought Kingpin with Daredevil only once in season 3. But then Spider-Man fought him alone in the end. Now that we've gotten through the cast, how about we talk some music? There's some interesting quirks with this production part of the process. The main theme is pretty iconic, and for a reason, because Joe Perry from Aerosmith came to perform it. Now, it is known that the theme song is made by Joe Perry and then also alongside held by Shuki Levi and a couple of others. But he basically made those awesome guitarists, and that is something that I've not really seen anywhere else. But the distinctive difference between the theme song and the actual soundtrack of the show is that this had only an orchestral soundtrack, like Batman, the animated series. An Israel composer and who had his own orchestral theme, Audi Harpaz from Israel, was contacted by John Semper, and everything he made before the show pilot ever came, before that part, all the music tracks that were used in the first episode was basically all that he had composed, and then they were recycled all the way to the end. So everything Audi Harpaz composed was used only in the show. That's about, I would say, 20 to 30 tracks, and then Shuki Levi came in, who is an industry veteran at the time already, and then he helped to compose certain maybe character themes, but the ambient themes and everything else was done by Audi Harpaz and his composers. Now, this is the part where we differ from every single animated series from that date, before it, and then afterwards. The show was made as a one consistent long story arc that evolved with every episode, every chapter, and it never had this part where you'd feel like something stagnated back in another episode. Something always came up with recurring characters or something that was left as kind of a dormant character for a little while and then brought back again, and then the storyline kind of continued from there. And it was always unexpected to see that, hey, look at that, Morbius is back. Why is he there? And then you recognize, they didn't change anything in him. Everything that happened with Morbius before in the show, in another episode, still sticks around as plot. It doesn't disappear. It's not like a, let's say, a villain of the week type of episode, where you introduce a villain, you defeat it, and he doesn't appear again, unless it's a main villain of a show. That's a different story. Now, the stories were always season-long chapters, which events would remain intact throughout the show. The network was very against this idea. John Semper is basically the rebellion who got this negotiated, because if he didn't get this through, he would have left the show. He would have never written any of these episodes that were within the show or the show would have never happened the way it did, because he managed to negotiate the creative rights for making that happen. Of course, the financial struggles with Marvel basically gave him more creative control as to nobody was supervising what he wrote. Sometimes they might have come and said, you can't do that, but he ignored it, literally ignored it. These days, you have so many restrictions and guidelines and other things to consider that you can't do the same that one man did with an entire show. He was a co-producer and a head writer for the entire show, and he hired a couple of other talents while he was working on the show in the later seasons. Now, the story, how to basically dissect it, that every story had a main storyline, naturally, but then there were always these evolving B-plots. How many of you know what a B-plot is? Just to, yeah, okay. So a B-plot is basically always something that happens on the background of the main plot of an episode or maybe a season of any other kind of TV show that you might watch. Now, the interesting thing is about these plots, the B portion, is that everything that happens on the background with another character that is not the focus of the episode's story, but is portrayed there on the background as the B plot, it sticks around as character build and story that will still be, that reflects to the show's later half, if the character recurs. Let's say, for example, let me think a good one. I would say Alistair Smythe, Kingpin's assistant, who appeared in the first episode second episode with the Spider Slayers, where his father became apparently deceased, but then the plot of his father being dead in the show. You can't use dead, by the way, in the show. That was a banned word. You should use thrown into another dimension or something. Censorship, actually. But in the later, down the line, when Alistair is made a robot himself, when Kingpin betrays him, and then he makes him a Mega Slayer, basically. Then he finds out that, his father is not dead. Kingpin hid his body in a chamber where he lied dormant throughout season 1 all the way till maybe season 3, 4, where it happened, where he gets revealed that his father is still alive. That means the whole B plot stuck around for that long that you could just write it down and hold the audience in a suspense that, will he ever find his father? Well, guess what? I can just do that and bring him here. You can't do that kind of thing on a long-running series where you would have something happening in a early half of a show and then bring it back seasons later. You can't expect that, because this 65 episodes that were ordered already for starting from 1994, this was unexpected. This was about the cap of how many episodes an animated series or a TV show would get, that you could write story that far ahead, which is why these kinds of evolving B-plots would be around. And what John Semper already has said also in the interview, which I conducted, the show was never a Spider-Man show, but a Peter Parker show. It's about human growth, not the hero side of it, but what happens in his civilian life. That was the main focus of what they wanted you to pay a close attention. Now, I'm going to give you a couple of examples of the story arcs that happened during a couple of chapters, for example, so that you understand how the storytelling was done. Now, in the very first season, the chapters didn't have a name. The chapter was untitled. But during this, there was the Alien Suit Saga, which was a 3-episode-long portrayal of how the symbiote arrived on Earth, which is not something that happened in the comics with Venom, but was kind of alterated that would evolve into Brock becoming Venom, knowing the identity of Spider-Man, and then this would go on to season 3, when Venom returns. So these kinds of plot lines always move around between the seasons, but always a main focus that starts to evolve and then hits its peak at some point. But after season 1, they started naming these chapters. Now there's an actual consistency. The Neogetic Nightmare is the name of the second chapter / season 2. And the core theme of that is that when Peter Parker's Spider-Man mutations are starting to make him feel ill, lose his powers, what happens in the comics too, and then what happens during this portrayal of his disease and what happens on the background when he does something to cure himself, something happens in the background and Michael Morbius comes up. He's not a vampire when he shows up as a civilian character at first, but he becomes Morbius, the vampire, when Peter does something. Everything he does always has this kind of consequence that he has to live with, and then he has to find out, what can I do to fix it? That's the kind of plot line that would remain and move on throughout the show all the way to the end. Michael Morbius actually showed up all the way to the end of the show. Now, the themes of the show, this is where I would like to talk about Chapter 3, where there's a clear distinction of themes. In the name Sins of the Fathers is basically where Hobgoblin is first introduced. Now, Norman Osborn is, of course, the father of Harry Osborn. The sin of the father here is that Norman ignores Harry's problems in his civilian life, and he becomes the villain, Green Goblin. But then later down the line, the sins of the father come haunting Harry after Green Goblin is originally defeated, that being Norman. Now, then when Harry becomes the Green Goblin, that chapter theme still remains intact as the sin of the father. And even, for example, when Carnage is introduced to the show, it's basically named that Venom is the father of Carnage. Sins of the father. There is a consistent theme. This is kind of meta lore, if you will. And for example, let's call it daddy issues, because there's Green Goblin is a father issue. Daredevil, Matt Murdock, had father issues with his past when he lost his father, and they are interconnected with the Kingpin, who also had father issues. And that is also portrayed in the series. So there's always a consistent theme within a chapter, and you always have to watch over and over again to find out that this is what they're talking about. This is why it's always interesting to come back and watch this, since it's a rather short show in terms of runtime, so that you can just come back and watch, hey, this is something I always missed. I didn't think that there would be something so deep in it. Now, I'm going to go in a little deep dive here with the B-plot examples and the themes that run in terms of the network's kind of educational guidelines, because at the time, for example, Fox were trying to run this kind of edutainment type of programming. And certain themes that were portrayed within Spider-Man, for example, they weren't strict guidelines, but they were still portrayed as societal kind of growth, that how to be a responsible civilian in a certain way, which are mentioned right here. But first, let's get to the actual B-plots here, as now that I've explained them, instead of being just one-off bits, they last throughout the time. I'll give you an example about Felicia Hardy and Michael Morbius here. When Michael comes around in season 2 to New York as a student and becomes the vampire, Felicia Hardy already has dated Michael for a short period of time. They've gone out for a few dates, and then when Michael becomes a vampire, he has his human memory of Felicia Hardy being someone he is deeply involved with. And so when he still tries to chase that, they become kind of symbiote between that. The love story evolves because later down the line, when Michael Morbius' plotline goes dormant throughout after season 2, when Morbius is found sleeping in a cave, and then he is brought back to New York, and Felicia Hardy becomes Black Cat, the love between them, the human relationship, is still there. They still manage to somehow create this love story between those two, and it is a B-plot that runs around through the show when Felicia Hardy still thinks of Michael Morbius, because she has other relationships in between, like trying to go on a date with Peter Parker or Flash Thompson or somebody else, but they don't feel right because she still thinks of Michael Morbius. And then later down the line, Michael appears again, and she has those emotions again. And that comes to a conclusion when they go around to travel in Europe to find the vampire queen. Miriam was her name. And they become partners. Basically lovers, but partners in that term that, can you love me as a vampire? Yes, I can. That's the kind of story that evolves as a B-plot during the show. And the other examples that I have already mentioned were Venom's story, where Venom becomes an anti-hero, Eddie Brock. First, he is a selfish journalist who does everything to get what he wants: fame, money. But when he becomes Venom, he becomes selfish. He knows the identity of Peter Parker as Spider-Man, and he wants to ruin his life like he kind of ruined his. And then the storyline begins again in season 3 when Venom shows up and Eddie and the Venom symbiote come to again. And when the episode 2-parter ends with Eddie sent to another dimension, literally, this isn't talking about death in a certain way, but sent to another dimension where you could come back from, he basically has his redemption arc, where he saves the day, where Spider-Man has to make a decision who is his friend and foe. Because keep your friends close and enemies closer. That is the kind of story example where you have this kind of a philosophical quote used here, where it comes to fruition with Venom. And of course, Harry Osborn becoming the Green Goblin as the sin of the father, as in the P-plot evolves to that point, and where he actually also finds out that, oh, my father was the Green Goblin. But then he sucks it in and says, oh, I'm supposed to be the Green Goblin too. My father wanted this to me. That was the kind of thing that always disturbed me in a bit, but, you know, stories. Now, the certain themes that were kind of this edutainment portion of the show were parental issues. I'll give you one example of that. Mary Jane Watson and his relationship to his father. In the season 3 episode where Doctor Strange also shows up, they go to this center of reunification, would it be, if it was the name, where Dormammu is trying to be released by Mordo, the evil wizard. And he brainwashes the kids where Mary Jane sees his father in an illusion. And when Doctor Strange and Spider-Man tell her that it's an illusion, you have to get rid of it, you have to fight it yourself. That what is the reality with your father, how it was when you were a child. And they show a certain small scene where they're in their apartment complex where his father screams at her and her mother, and then she realizes, oh, I did have a bad father relationship. It kind of represents these societal issues that we have as reality, so that people could relate to the story somehow. A connection, like Crime and Economy, where there would be someone, a punk who does a crime, and he joins a gang, and then his father, let's take an example. Robbie Robertson, who works at Daily Bugle, his son joins a gang run by Tombstone. And before that, Tombstone knew Robbie Robertson and was trying to make him go to the path of crime. But then he decided to do differently, and he kind of makes soon to become Tombstone look guilty, and he takes the fall. So Tombstone comes with a vengeance plot to make his son become what he did. Now, when Robbie stops this, he kind of shows that we have to tell the truth. We have to be strict about it, because in the end, justice wins. It's a belief to the justice system that whenever you commit a crime, you do go to jail. But if you're honest about what happened, you always have the truth. Now, of course, power and corruption are something that are best portrayed by the Kingpin. What he does in the show, for example, like hacking into, let's say, a prison, what's the word? Prison records, yes, prison records, to change someone's prison penitentiary location. For example, what he did to Robbie, so that Tombstone could get to him. The kind of themes that run around are still rampant today. So this is why all of these themes that are portrayed in the show never get old. They're something that always stick around somehow. And yeah, I do kind of feel disappointed that they do. But that's why this is such a powerful show, if you dig deeper into the themes that the show is trying to portray for its writing and through the demonstration of how it's done. All right, and now as the ending part, we're going to go through the end cycle of the show and what is a beginning of a legacy when it comes to the core theme of this lecture, which is the inspiration to MCU after the show. So as we said, Spider-Man ran for 65 episodes and being the longest show to date, actually, before Ultimate Spider-Man reaching 78 episodes. And it is the only animated show with the unique storytelling method that has been portrayed here, and it still hasn't been recreated in any way. And was also the first show to show the majority of Marvel characters at the time, because they could. Blade, Punisher, almost everyone you can imagine was showing up in there. Only probably 4 was someone who never came into any of Marvel's other shows either. But that is something that becomes later down the line, of course, in the Avengers. But he was never given an animated show either. As mentioned, it would inspire MCU by a long stretch. And what this show created, this is the one that I want to highlight. How many of you have seen the Spider-Verse movies? Spider-Verse was introduced in 1998 in this show, right at the finale. Spider-Wars was the theme, where everyone from the different dimensions, the Madam Web, brings them together to fight a war against one Spider-Man entity, who becomes Spider-Carnage. Is the first portrayal of Spider-Verse, and where John Semper created the name Spider-Verse, it was never used up until officially in the movie. And the plotline is actually pretty similar. There is this time accelerator, which they use to jump through portals. And they want to basically explode that, which is the same thing that Kingpin was trying to do in the Spider-Verse, the first movie, if I remember correctly, where there is the device where it opens gateways to other dimensions, but then someone wants to disturb that timeline somehow. And that was what happened during the ending of this show. But before we have time for questions, I will show you the pictorial example of how it's shown during the early days of MCU, starting from Raimi. Here we have the first picture around the corner on your left, where Spider-Man fights the Green Goblin on the George Washington Bridge. This is a scene above in Sam Raimi's first Spider-Man, where he's also fighting Green Goblin, and the fight took also place in George Washington Bridge. And both at the scenes that happened during the movie and the episode, Green Goblin is being pounded by the glider. He's killed in that, but in Spider-Man the Animated Series, he's sent through a portal, but still stuck in that glider that hits him. It's a complete recreation of the scene. In Spider-Man 2, when Doc Ock basically does his revengeful plot after he becomes Dr. Octavius, he starts to kidnap people. Like he's kidnapped Aunt May above. He starts off with his first appearance in Spider-Man the Animated Series by kidnapping Felicia Hardy and demanding money. For his experiments, of course, because he's a scientist. I'm a man of science. And in Spider-Man 3, when Eddie Brock becomes Venom, they're at the clock tower. Spider-Man gets rid of the symbiote by going next to high-frequency sound so that the symbiote gets, so that he gets rid of the symbiote. And the exact same thing happens in Spider-Man the Animated Series during the Alien Suit Saga. And the goo falls on Eddie Brock at the end of the the first episode, actually. And then he becomes Venom. And the same thing happens right here. He's being tied up somewhere, and Peter Parker doesn't care what happens to people, just like he didn't care when he had the suit, and is still portrayed the same way. Brock is scared of it at first, but when the symbiote takes over, of course, he becomes a rampant maniac. Actually, I do have one more. Spider-Man the Animated Series in Finland, because we actually have a pretty big tradition here when it comes to also the merchandise. We have a bit of a difference between US at least. US never, I looked at the catalog online where they list all the Spider-Man toy lines and merchandise that was released. They didn't have soda. We did. It made your tongue blue. I tasted it back when I was a kid. It was good, but it was banned. Thanks you. Something that I'll never get over it, because look at that cover. And I mean, I would buy it instantly again. In the US, there were also audiobooks, but they were a bit different from what we got and in the form of an audiobook. When they had this kind of an audiobook where you pressed a button, it would create a sound. We got a mixtape, which you put in a cassette box, and it would play a story which we would read through a book, and it was narrated with voice acting. It was like a soap opera for kids. How did we get something so smart that US didn't? This was taken actually from a website that is still selling it for what was it, €4? Yeah, that cheap. Of course, it has suffered a lot of damage at the time, but I had that as a kid. They made a lot of these in Finland at the time. I remember that I still have my copy of the movie adaptation of Star Wars Episode 1, for example, and Batman the Animated Series, the episode of, was it Mr. Freeze? Yes, the second one. Now, unfortunately, there is a bit of a surprise here that after this lecture program is over, and next year when they publish this online at some point, when I send the material to the editing team, I will be adding an interview which I got as a pre-recorded video from John Semper Jr., the man behind Spider-Man the Animated Series, the head writer and co-producer, where he talks about the show, which I portrayed 11 questions, and it is 30 minutes long, so it is a special cut for everyone who, A, didn't make the show, but B, you get to hear it from first. Unfortunately, I didn't get my sound box moving, so I wasn't able to portray it to you here, but since we only have 45 minutes of runtime, just like a two-part story, perhaps, but that will be available maybe next year. And if so, then you will be able to hear his thoughts. And also, he will be saying greeting to ropecon, even though it is a year later. But it is still celebrating Spider-Man the 30th anniversary. Thank you very much, everyone. Are there any questions or memories you would like to share? How many of you have seen this show? Oh, excellent. Those of you who haven't seen the show, Disney Plus is still showing this, and it is with Finnish subtitles, if you will, and it has all the 65 episodes. This is available. I myself decided to do a bit of a different thing when I made my research for this, and I bought an original 2011 DVD, which had this entire show packed in it, with also a unique kind of a thing where the first season was dubbed in Swedish, Italian, and I believe German as well. That is a pretty interesting thing. This show was never dubbed in Finnish, so go and find the DVD because it is expensive. I think I paid about $150 for it, so don't do that. Don't be a high fan. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. My name is John Semper. I was one of the producers and the one and only head writer of Spider-Man the Animated Series. We are celebrating our 30th anniversary this year. Actually, it sort of started at the very tail end of last year. And I am happy to be saying hello to all my fans in Finland at ropecon. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. So I have a whole bunch of questions here. I have about 1,000 questions here that I have been asked to answer for you. And I'm going to dive right in no particular order. So the first question says, through the show's runtime of 65 episodes, you and the staff had a lot of creative control over the production of Spider-Man the Animated Series. Can you tell us about it and describe the experience in comparison to today's world of other shows having to deal with heavier demands of censorship, management over production from the networks, etc.? Well, it wasn't really me and the staff, it was me. And in the very beginning, for about the first 13 episodes, there was a lot of oversight. So I tend to think of those episodes as being more by committee, and they were kind of the villain of the week. But after the first 13, and maybe starting with the 13th episode, a lot of the oversight started to drop away, and I had much more control over the series. By the end of the series, I had pretty much total creative control. I wasn't really answering to anyone, and that was a very unique circumstance. I don't think that happened very much back then, and it certainly it wouldn't happen today. A lot of times when people ask me, would I want to do a new Spider-Man show for Sony and Disney? Sometimes I think probably not, because there would be so much oversight that it just wouldn't be the same. By the time I got to the end of my series, I had a lot of creative control, probably all the creative control. And that was a pretty great thing. I don't think I could ever get that kind of circumstance again. In today's world, Marvel is such a big entity, and there are so many interconnected pieces with the movies and all that sort of stuff, the TV shows, that I don't think the corporations would allow the showrunners to pretty much go their own way. When I did my show, Marvel was on the verge of bankruptcy, so they had no oversight over me. And then I really was only answerable to the network and Avi Arad, who was the executive producer. And after a while, both of those entities kind of drifted away, and I was pretty much allowed to do what I wanted to do. So that's the answer to question number one. Question number two, when I did research and read a lot upon the show originally, let's start again. When I did research and I read a lot upon it, that the show originally had a lot more storylines before its cancellation. Would you open up information on some storylines that never came to fruition? And would the show have lasted longer than 65 episodes if so? No, actually the show was contracted for 65 episodes. It was never supposed to run beyond 65 episodes. You know, there's always a chance that something might get picked up for more episodes, but no, it was 65 was the full run. And by the way, 65 episodes made it for a very long time, and it may still be true, the longest running Spider-Man episode, the longest running Spider-Man series ever. And it might still be true to this day. So 65 episodes is a huge order, and you rarely get to go beyond that. That happens to be, I guess, the magic number that they can go into syndication with, or at least it was back in the day. And that was a very important marketplace, the syndicated marketplace. So if you got to 65 episodes, everyone was happy, and that was pretty much the order. In terms of further storylines, I really didn't have anything else in mind. I ended it the way I wanted to end it. And when you've got the hero and he finally is kind of happy and content with himself, and that's Peter Parker, because I always regarded the show as being the Peter Parker show, not the Spider-Man show. And when Peter Parker gets to the point where he says, I really like myself, and I'm really happy with my life, that's pretty much the end of the story. And that's where I left him in episode 65. So there really weren't any continuing storylines. If someone had put a gun to my head and said, no, you must continue it, then I had a few ideas of where I would like to go. But I didn't expect that was going to happen. So it ended pretty much where it was supposed to end. Question number 3. You introduced the concept of Spider-Verse in the show's finale. In my opinion, you are the father of that idea. Have you ever gotten universal creative respect or credit for that officially from any known creative source afterwards? And could you also tell us about how your own twists a bit that you created within Spider-Man, the animated series, which differs from the source material used, and also about your original idea you made within the show? Okay. Well, there's a little bit of a language barrier there, so I'm going to try to answer as best as I can. I did create the Spider-Verse. In fact, I recently found out that I had given an interview in the very early stages of my series, and I used the word Spider-Verse. So it's entirely probable that I created the word. I certainly created the Spider-Verse, and the plot of that first Spider-Verse movie is exactly the same plot as the end of my series, which is that the Kingpin is threatening to destroy all of reality by exploding a bomb in a temporal portal. I mean, that's exactly what I did in my show. That was my idea. It was no one else's. It did not come from a comic book. Have I ever gotten creative respect? Certainly not from Marvel. I get a lot of it from the fans, for which I am grateful. But I did not. Marvel does not acknowledge my creation of the Spider-Verse. I have never been thanked at the end of any of those hugely successful Spider-Verse movies. As I say, the first of which was basically exactly the same plot as my introduction of the concept. No one's ever acknowledged that I invented the word Spider-Verse. So no, I do not get. I've not gotten any proper response from Marvel, and that's where that stands. You are the pioneer of creating a cartoon that had a linear, progressive, and continuous linked storyline instead of one-off episodes through most of the show, as like a soap opera. How hard did you have to fight to make it happen? And do you feel like it had any effect as a method in the future of creating stories for animated shows that followed up yours no matter the creator? As in, do you feel like it was ever used after Spider-Man, the animated series runtime? Well, I grew up with a very wonderful show called Zorro, Walt Disney's Zorro. And it was the only show in my entire childhood that had a continuing storyline. One of my other favorite shows was Star Trek, and they carried over ideas from one episode to another, but not actual linear plot lines. That was a very rare thing in the 50s and the 60s. I grew up watching TV in the 50s and the 60s, and continuing storylines were something that networks did not like. And in animation, it was completely not anything that anyone did. But when I took over Spider-Man, I wanted the experience for the kids that were going to be watching to be exactly like it was when I read the comic book. I started reading the Spider-Man comic book pretty much at the beginning. Yes, I'm that old. And I was really enthralled by the episodic storytelling. So I wanted to recreate that for kids. Now, I knew that I would not really be allowed to do it, so I never asked permission. I just did it. And no one was really happy that I did it, because it simply wasn't anything that was done in cartoons at that time in the early 90s. But it was important to me to replicate the kind of experience that I had reading the Spider-Man comic book. In fact, that was really what I wanted to do in general with the series, was completely repeat the kind of excitement that I had when I first read the comic book. It was my favorite comic book character. This is the best thing that happened to all you viewers out there, is that Spider-Man happened to be my favorite comic book character. And so when I got the show, I knew exactly how to make it, how to structure it, so that it would repeat the kinds of things that had made it exciting for me. So anyway, no, in fact, by the end of the series, Fox finally kind of put their foot down and said, don't do it anymore. But it was too late. And again, I just continued doing it. I never got permission to do it. And mostly they just sort of didn't realize I was doing it until it was too late. As many creations from either film or TV, some had a heavy connection to making it toyetic into other markets. Spider-Man TAS wasn't any different. Regarding this, there was a story about Madam Web's character in Hobgoblins. Hobgoblins. Can you tell us about it? Yes. The story is that when I first proposed using Madam Web to Avi Arad, who ran Toy Biz, he was our executive producer, but he also ran Toy Biz, and he was making toys based on our series. That was a very important thing to him. When I first proposed that I wanted to use Madam Web, he said, I can't make a toy out of an old broad. One of my greatest moments in the history of my association with Spider-Man was when he finally did make a toy out of that old broad. There is a Madam Web toy. In fact, I have it on my toy wall behind me somewhere, and I'm very proud of that toy. The other thing about the Hobgoblin, well, yes, I mean, if any good Spider-Man fan knows that the Green Goblin comes before the Hobgoblin. So the fact that we had to introduce the Hobgoblin before the Green Goblin was because my predecessor, I was not the first story editor, head writer on Spider-Man. The first fellow got fired. And when I came on, I was not able to look at any of his material, because that was part of his contract, was that if they got rid of him, they couldn't use any of his material. So I started from scratch. But the only decision of his that I ended up having to live with was that for some reason that I will never know, he decided that the Hobgoblin was going to be the only goblin villain that Spider-Man was going to face. And he was not going to face the Green Goblin at all. And so I said, well, no, you can't do that. You have to start with the Green Goblin and then eventually get to the Hobgoblin. But because he had made that decision, Avi had, remember, the toys have to be planned at least a year in advance, if not more, if not longer. And so Avi had already planned a very elaborate Hobgoblin toy. And by the time I came onto the show, that toy was in production, and Avi was afraid that if we didn't have the Hobgoblin in the show, then that toy would not sell. So even though I argued vociferously to not have the Hobgoblin come first, because of the toy, eventually I was just left. Avi just said, no, we've got to do the Hobgoblin. So I figured out a way to work around it, but I was never happy with that. And unfortunately, my predecessor is deceased, so I cannot ask him why he decided to do that, why he came up with that idea. But it was the wrong idea. And that's his only legacy in the show is choosing to have the Hobgoblin come first. That's his only lasting impact on the show. Let's see. Spider-Man TAS aired in a lot of places around the world, including here in Finland, with a few-year delay after the '94 premiere in the U.S. How well are you aware of the show's spreading distribution over the world? Our neighbor country, Sweden, even went as far as dubbing it, for example. And as a kid, I even got to witness that Italy was still airing the show in the early mid-2000s. Well, it's wonderfully exciting to know that my work is in places that I've never been. And I did know that the show was airing around the world. In fact, I knew that in England it was doing quite well and getting very good ratings. And I think somebody told me once it was airing in prime time. So I don't know if that's true or not, but I thought that was pretty cool. I recently met a fellow who grew up watching my show in Russia. And in fact, he met me last year. He'll be at Comic-Con again this year in San Diego in a few days. I'll be there. And that was exciting to meet someone in Russia who had become a Spider-Man fan. So I'm delighted. I mean, I am eternally grateful to have all of you wonderful people who are excited about the show after all these years, and to know that I will be, you'll be seeing this in Finland is a wonderful thing. And I thank all of you fans for all of the tremendous loyalty and dedication to the show after all these years. All right, next question. Your work on Spider-Man TAS has always been said by fans being a sort of guidebook for the MCU as inspiration. Are there any distinctive, clear examples from the MCU you can say Spider-Man TAS has involvement in? Well, one of the things that always cracks me up is when people make trailers. They take the soundtrack for a brand new trailer for a brand new Marvel movie, and then they just take the soundtrack, but they put the images from my series. Because we did it all first. We did everything first. We had Daredevil. We had Daredevil interacting with Spider-Man. We had the Punisher. We had Blade. It was, to my knowledge, it's the first time I was the first person to bring Blade to the TV screen. There was a scene in Doctor Strange where he's floating in the middle of interdimensional space, and he's on like an asteroid, standing there, and he's talking to Dormammu, and that scene came right out of my series. We had Venom come to Earth on a space shuttle from the moon, and that was the way they introduced Venom in the Venom movies and in the Marvel Cinematic Universe that Sony made. So yeah, it's exciting. And then, of course, the Spider-Verse. So the fact that they have cannibalized so much of my series for the Marvel Cinematic Universe is wonderful, because there's nothing greater for a creator like me than to know that your ideas are really solid and are really good. And the fact that they have used, some would say stolen, so many of my ideas reinforces my pride in the fact that my ideas are really good, especially the Spider-Verse. So I'm very excited about that. It would be great if they had given me some credit for it, but you know, it's Hollywood. And the fact that the fans realize that we were the first, and the X-Men animated series, along with me, we were the first Marvel Cinematic Universe. In fact, it was my idea to bring the X-Men onto my show. And it was also my idea to bring the Fantastic Four onto my show. So I really was able, I was very lucky in that I had all of the Marvel Universe at my fingertips, and I could play with any of the characters. There were only a couple of characters that I couldn't use. One of them was the Hulk, but I could use every other character, and I did. And it was wonderful to be able to do that. So yes, we really were, X-Men and Spider-Man really were the beginning of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. whether they ever give us credit for it or not. During your life after Spider-Man the Animated Series ended, you had an original, different ending planned than what we got aired originally. Can you tell us a bit about how that story would have continued till its actual planned ending you wanted when Madam Web left our world to find Mary Jane? Well, just a correction. I didn't have a different ending planned. I ended it exactly the way I wanted to end it. I did, however, leave open a door. If Fox had said, we need 13 more episodes, then I did have a plan for where I would go with that. And what I have done, over the years, people say, well, the show got left in a cliffhanger. Well, it didn't. A cliffhanger is when you leave characters in jeopardy. And nobody was really left in jeopardy at the end of my show. Madam Web turned to Peter and said, we'll go get Mary Jane. He said, great. End of story. But apparently, I let a lot of fans down, a lot of viewers down by not actually having Peter find Mary Jane. And so I have subsequently written a script called Peter Finds Mary Jane that I will make available to everybody that indicates where I would have gone if I had continued the series and how Peter would have found Mary Jane. So I'm flashing on your screen right now a link to go to my link tree, which will take you to all of my socials, and you will be able to find out how to obtain a copy of that script. That script is pretty much how I would have ended everything, and I wrote it about 10 years ago just because I kind of felt like for all the fans that were thinking that they never knew how it was going to end, I wanted them to be able to have something from me to indicate how I would have brought Peter and Mary Jane together. But I will reiterate. So I'm flashing on the screen where you can go to eventually get your hands on that script. But I will reiterate that my series ended exactly the way I wanted it to end. And I was not in any way, shape, or form prevented from ending it the way I wanted. I had total control over how it ended. And anything that I've done since then, this script that I'm talking about, Peter Finds Mary Jane, that's just a little extra cherry on the top for all of you fans out there who are still having sleepless nights over whether or not Peter and Mary Jane ever got together. So there you go. The creative control of the show was heavily supervised, for example, regarding it needing to have an educational angle. Could you open up about what those educational guidelines about what needed to be in the episodes? No, that's just wrong. I was not heavily supervised regarding it needing to have an educational angle. No, not at all. No education. You were not supposed to learn anything from Spider-Man, which was one of the reasons that made it so great. I'm currently finishing up 40 episodes on a new show that is nothing but an educational show. It's totally educational. It's very entertaining. It's called Weather Hunters, and it's based on a family that runs around and examines weather, looks at weather, and finds out what causes weather. It's mostly for little kids. I do a lot of writing for little kids. And here in this country, it will be on an educational station, PBS, which is an educational network. So there is a difference. I have done educational stuff in the past. Spider-Man was not in any way, shape, or form meant to be educational. In fact, if you walked away being dumber as a result of Spider-Man, I couldn't be more happy. And I'm just kidding. I think Spider-Man is a brilliant show and appeals to extremely intellectual people like yourselves, but it was not meant to be educational at all. Now that it has been 30 years after the show, do you feel like there has been any kind of growth story written and created anywhere in the media form after yours when it comes to the life of Peter Parker and Spider-Man in terms of developing your own personality and character as a human being? The way the show ended with the words, "We all have to grow up sometime, even us characters of fiction," I wrote that, is something I've never witnessed anywhere after that in any close form. Well, the reality is that I do not read comics. And in fact, I had probably stopped reading comics around 1980, which is when I got into the film business and TV business. And the reason I was chosen to run Spider-Man was because I was a seasoned TV writer and showrunner. I had already run a couple of animated series, so everybody knew that I was capable of doing that. When they decide to make an animated series, they are investing millions of dollars, and they want to make sure that the person with whom they have placed all their faith, the person who is creatively in charge of that show, they want to make sure that that person knows what they're doing. And so they, in those days, would hand it off to someone who had already run a show. And as I say, I had run several. The thing is, though, that, and where you all got lucky, was that I had been a Spider-Man fan. I had grown up reading Spider-Man from issue number 1, really. And I knew what made the character fun and exciting. But I am not a comic book expert. I had stopped reading comic books in 1980, which is when I came out to LA and started my career in Hollywood. I didn't have time for comics anymore, and also I had kind of outgrown them a little bit. That was a very bad era for comics. The 1980s was not one of the best eras for comics. So, with a few exceptions, I think X-Men being one of them. But I am not a comic expert. I am not an avid comic reader very much anymore. I don't read Spider-Man. And that's partially because, A, I don't read comics, but the other one is that once you've handled a character and done it your way, it's very hard to look at how someone else is doing it, because it just kind of makes you feel like they're doing it wrong. So when I was done with Spider-Man, I said goodbye to Spider-Man, and I was very happy, and I still love the character. And I actually didn't see any of the movies for a long time. I'd run into my friend Pat Jankowitz, who's a journalist, every now and then at conventions, and he'd say, "Do you know that they're taking your ideas and blah, 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 blah." But I actually wasn't watching any of the shows, any of the movies, until recently. With Tom Holland, I had been far enough away from the character that I could watch the movies and not feel very connected to it. And those movies I thought were really very good, and I thought he's very good. I really like him as Spider-Man. But that's a whole different Spider-Man than the one that I created, or the one that was in the comics in the 60s when I was a Spider-Man fan. So it would be hard for me to comment on any other interpretation of Peter Parker. I've not watched any of the other cartoon shows. People, write about how Spectacular Spider-Man's great and Ultimate Spider-Man is great and all these different Spider-Man shows. I'm sure they're wonderful. They should be wonderful. They had my show to look at before they even got started. So I would hope that they would have learned something. But I have not watched a single Spider-Man cartoon show since mine, and I'm okay with that. But I hope that the viewers. One thing I am proud of is that a lot of kids who watch my show are now in their 30s, and I run into them at conventions, and they're really decent, fine human beings. They're good people, and I like to feel that anybody who watched my show and really liked it has now carried some of those values with them into the world, and they are good people. So that makes me very proud. I'm proud to have put out a show. I was kidding a little while back when I said it would make you dumber. I always would like for anything that I do to make you smarter and to make you a better human being and to make the world a better place, because I think that is the role of the artist. The role of the artist is to bring enlightenment and comfort. And so enlightenment about the world and the people around you, and comfort in knowing that there are good values out there and that you should adopt them. So I'm very proud of the show and the reaction that people who grew up watching it are having. And many of them are now parents, and they're now showing my series to their kids, which I think is cool. So that's that. Now, my last question here. Spider-Man TAS's production was quite hectic in certain terms, from launching the pilot and all the way to the end, since at the same time Marvel had ongoing financial issues, which ended up in bankruptcy in '96. How did it affect the show's making? Well, the production was hectic because they had a guy who was the head writer who didn't work out. They had to let him go. And then by the time they brought me on, I had very little time to get the show up and running. But that was great because there wasn't a lot of time for people to bicker and fool around, even though they wanted to and even though they tried. And so I just kind of bowed my head forward and kept the show moving forward. The pilot, I hired Jerry Conway, who is a wonderful writer, he was a great TV writer, but he also had been very instrumental in the original Spider-Man comic book. I read his writing when I was a fan. I brought him in. I had a very strong idea of how I wanted that first story to go, how I wanted the first season to go. I had to wrangle the egos of Avi Arad and Stan Lee and other various people in the production. And it was a battle to kind of get everybody on the same page. And there's always kind of, political stuff going on in any new show. There were certain people who resented the fact that I had the amount of creative control that I did, and they made it very clear to me that they would like for me to vanish into thin air. But I don't vanish very well. I stood my ground, and I was able to get the show on a firm footing. And by episode 14, the show really took off in the direction that I wanted it to. And I would say from the moment The Punisher arrived, which was, I believe, episode 14, the show really explodes into everything I wanted it to be. And the one before that, episode 13, I wrote that one. That was Day of the Chameleon, still one of my favorite episodes. So, it was hectic and it was difficult. We were delivering one script a week for a very good long time. I had some wonderful writers on the show. I always list them and give them credit. Mark Hoffmeyer was my first hire, then Stan Berkowitz, then ultimately Jim Krieg, Ernie Altbacker, Meg McLaughlin. They were wonderful to work with. I assembled a really good team around me. I think the quality of the writing was excellent. I think really the reason the show exists in anyone's list of favorite cartoon shows is because of the quality of the writing. And I think the quality of the writing was excellent. I'm very proud of that. I'm very proud of the people who've worked on the show, who've gone on to have really wonderful careers and win Emmys and do all kinds of exciting things. I reunited with Jim Krieg and Ernie Altbacker a couple of years ago when I wrote the Green Lantern, Beware My Power, Green Lantern, Beware My Power for DC as part of their animated universe. I love that movie. I wrote that with Ernie, and it was produced by Jim. It was exciting to be working with a couple of guys whose careers I had really kind of started, and it was fun. I had great fun. I had great fun with all the people that were part of my writing staff. It was a good group, and we had a lot of fun, and I think we did some really good work. So, good grief, I think I have finished all of your questions. I hope I answered everything clearly. I love the show. I think it's the greatest Spider-Man animated show ever. It's the last show that it holds the distinction of being the only show in which all the original creative talents, writing talents in the comic book worked on my series. It's the last show where there will be a Spider-Man series where all the original creative writing talents will have worked on it. Jerry Conway, Marv Wolfman, Stan Lee, and that's exciting. That will never happen again. So it holds that distinction. I also think it's just a really, really, really good show. So I'm glad you guys do too. Hello from USA. Hello, Finland. I love the fact that you still love the show. Thank you so much. Thank you for making this possible. I'm talking into a camera, but I know that you're out there. I know that you're through the lens there somewhere, and I'm hoping you're enjoying yourselves, and I hope you enjoyed this. Anyway, thank you very much. Bye-bye. Oh, and don't forget to join my socials. Go to my link. Go to my link right here. Okay, bye-bye.